As we've been mirroring our lives with that of the Israelites in the Exodus wilderness, we are seeing a pattern here. First, they face a challenge, some kind of a challenge. Then they blame the leadership of Moses. And then God hears the complaints and responds by providing the resource that they are in need. So we see this pattern when they were at the Red Sea in Exodus chapter 14. And then when they were at the well where the water was bitter, which is in Exodus chapter 15. And this is a story that we did not read in this month. And then last week's story of manna and quail. We see the pattern too in chapter 16. And then again, the very story we read today about the water flowing out from the rock. All of these stories from the earlier portion of Exodus, which means these stories take place between Egypt and Sinai. So it's not closer to the promised land, but it is the earlier phase of the Exodus. So we can see a pattern developing with the people, a pattern that we can relate to even in our lives. The pattern of facing a challenge, looking for someone to blame for this challenge that I am experiencing, and that God who always hears our voice. We wonder what insights these Exodus stories speak to our lives today. And it begins and ends with this question. When our human needs are not met, what do we do? It begins with that question and ends with that question. Either if we are speaking about the challenges bigger than ourselves, right? Like surviving the pandemic world and the divisiveness in our culture, political, also the climate change that we need to tackle. Or if we're speaking about more personal level of challenges, like relational problems between two persons, job situations, or well-being of our physical or our spiritual selves. Whatever the pressing issue is with you right now. If I just stop right now and invite you to a deeper prayer, deep, silent prayer. Perhaps a little bit deeper than the brief prayer of Thanksgiving in the morning when you hear the birds and smell the freshness of the new day. Well, maybe a little bit deeper than that. But when you dive into that depth, that name, that face, that situation, which you can feel that it weighs your soul down into the depth of no answer. The question that we reflect on through these Exodus stories is, if our needs, that deep need, is not met, what do we do? What do we do? For the Israelites, they responded initially by whining, as you all know, and then as a threat, right? And which turned later into a complaint. The place was called Massa and Meribah, which meant the people quarreled and tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" They tested the Lord. And as this last question echoes somewhere in our heart, is the Lord among us or not? The part which we weren't paying too much attention, somewhere back of our minds when we were unconsciously complaining about how things are not going the way we think it should be going, we realize that there is something deeper about all of this. We realize that this is not just about feeling guilty about our failure to God's faithfulness towards us. It's not about that. But we recognize the times when we don't recognize God's presence in our lives. Which are the moments? Like we recognize the times, those moments when we don't even think about God in our lives. We just react with our emotions, with our complaints, and we forget that God is present. Those moments when we express our complaints, not just complaints, but our frustrations, we recognize in that echo those days when we view the world more as a platform of sin rather than viewing this world as a place which God loves so much, or viewing God's only role that of a judgment in our last days, rather than viewing God who is the goodness itself, who is the love itself, who is the peace itself and joy itself. When we repeat that question of ancient Israelites, is the Lord among us or not? We realize our forgetfulness of God's presence in our lives. And this may be not a matter of our personal spiritual intentionality and discipline. It may not be that. This may be a bigger thing. This week's episode I listened to of the Brave Little State program from the Vermont Public Radio. It was titled, this week's was titled, What's the State of Religion in Vermont? What's the state of religion in Vermont? And I guess most of it was nothing new, really. But I found it helpful that somebody spent the time to really look into that. Somebody who is not related to religion. So if you haven't heard it yet, you can go onto their website and listen to it. And it's only about like 20 minutes long. And it's interesting. Anyhow, it talks about the decreasing number of Vermonters who practices traditional form of religion, which is definitely not nothing new. But the point of this podcast was not trying to figure out why the number of church attendee is decreasing, but it is raising the question of then how are Vermonters practicing religion if they are not in church? So that was the question they were asking. And one of the interviewees said that even though she doesn't go to church on Sundays, she said that she continues to construct a sense of self in relation to the wider world. For her, doing yoga or spending time in the nature helps doing that, to construct a sense of self in relation to the wider world. And because I think this question is so relevant to our question as Christians, I was so impressed how she phrased that question, constructing a sense of herself in relation to the wider world. We may use a slightly different terminology in saying that, but in the essence of our journey, that is the journey we are on. But we tend to get obsessed with our theology or the ways we think, we do things, the rites, spelled R-I-T-E-S, the rites and our doctrines. We get obsessed with that. We tend to get fixed in our desire to differentiate what's right and what's wrong. And in the midst of doing that, we end up forgetting what this journey is all about. On a lighter note, when I was listening to this podcast, I learned a new word, a new terminology, and it's Vermonterism. Vermonterism. And it was new to me. I didn't have a chance to look it up, what that meant, but I almost felt like I knew exactly what that meant. So it's one of those words, Vermonterism. Anyhow, this journey of constructing a sense of self, this journey in the wilderness was exactly that of the Israelites. They were constructing their identity in relation to the wider world in that situation, or God. We can call it God, in relation to God. Michael J. Chan, who teaches Old Testament at St. Paul Lutheran Seminary in Minnesota, in his commentary talks about this soul-searching aspect of the Exodus story. So let me share what he wrote. He said, "We should note that they are not only on a journey through the wilderness, they are also on a journey of the soul, being transformed from an earlier existence as an enslaved people to that of an independent nation. Unlearning the habits of domination, reinforced by Pharaoh's extractive and cruel system of slavery and subjugation, and that is difficult, painful, and patient work. It is the work of generations, accepting kindness and generosity when all one has known is violent exploitation, was never going back to be a quick or easy process. Israel had been subjected to a brutal existence under the yoke of Pharaoh. But they suddenly find themselves free of Pharaoh's chains and the recipients of God's kindness and mercy. Few would disagree that one of the Bible's most difficult commands is the call to trust. This is especially true when the world teaches you that your survival depends upon distrust and skepticism. These wilderness stories demonstrate just how difficult it would be to transform a formerly enslaved people into a trusting nation. End quote. It was a transformational shift of who they were. And it didn't happen overnight. Obviously, it didn't happen overnight. And it actually took them a generation to go through that transition. Whole generation. Underneath the question we raised earlier of when our human needs are not met, what do we do? There is a deeper question that we should ask ourselves. Who are we in terms of our relationship with God? Especially when nothing seems grounded in our lives, when everything we knew before is now considered unknown, when the system, the lifestyle we were used to back in Egypt is not applicable into this new norm any longer. Perhaps it is an opportunity for us to go back to the most fundamental. Who are we in terms of our relationship with God? And we might complain along the way, and we might whine along the way. We will fail. and we will fail again in that relationship. So going back to that podcast from VPR, it ends with a conclusion that the state of religion in Vermont, that was what they were talking about. The state of religion in Vermont is that we are all trying to figure out what we are doing here. All right, we are all trying to figure out what we're doing here. And I really love this next part, which the host quotes from his old pastor. The pastor said, "We are trying to learn how to be part of the beauty, not part of the pain. We are trying to learn how to be part of the beauty, not part of pain." This journey is not going to be easy. It's not going to be quick either. God might make us walk in front of the very people who we fear will stone us to death, right? But the good news is that God said, "I will stand there before you." So let us continue in this journey. Let us pay attention to the level underneath our human needs. Let us pause for a moment before we express the frustration and the dissatisfaction in our lives. It won't always make sense to us at the moment of hunger and thirst, and we'll probably forget it pretty soon. But let us patiently pay attention to this gradual process of finding our place in this universe. Because when we arrive at the rock, God will stand there before us. And the violent stones that we feared from will transform into the rock where God's life-giving water flows out. And the staff, Moses' staff, which turned into a deadly snake once in the past and turned the whole river into blood, that staff will transform into something God uses to respond to our needs. So in the coming months, my plan and hope is that we can walk this wilderness as a church. As we reflect on that question, who are we as a church in terms of relationship with God and in this wider community of Montpelier and in this community of the world? And we'll take some time doing that. We won't be anxious to rush into anything. It'll take time. We learned that today. We'll be patient and we'll walk, but we will walk. Meanwhile, my hope is that each one of us will remember to take a pause, take a breath, and ask ourselves, who am I in relationship with God right now? Who am I in terms of our relationship with God right now on this September 27th, 2020? And I pray that God will be with us as each one of us continues to walk through this wilderness individually and together. Amen.